Hey YouTube, how's it going? We're going to continue with our daily coverage of OpenAI, the big shakeup, and then we'll also cover some new topics. We have exactly the right guest for you today. Bradley Tusk is here. He's the founder of Tusk Ventures, and he's the author of the new book, Obvious in Hindsight. It's a novel. He's writing about a novel about the tech world and regulation. It almost feels like, can you make the fiction more exciting than the nonfiction right now? We'll find out. Welcome to the show,
It's
Bradley.
yeah, art and life kind of keep imitating each other in really weird ways. So yeah, they're converging quite nicely.
Great. So, First of all, congrats on writing the book. We'll talk about
Thank
it
you.
more.
Sure.
Um, let's talk about some of the real life drama that's going on
Yeah.
right now.
Sure.
Right before we started this conversation, I thought, is there a better person to have discuss OpenAI than someone who's a VC who also works on regulation and tricky governance issues? And I
Yeah.
decided no, that you are the perfect person to discuss this.
I'm glad to be that person.
Tell me what you think about the makeup of the OpenAI board and where do you think this is heading?
Yeah. I mean, look, it in retrospect, in hindsight, it was sort of destined to fail, right? In the sense that there's got to be alignment between board members with investors, shareholders, and employees. And when the board members think their job is one thing and everyone else thinks their job is something else, clearly there's going to be friction. And to the point here, there was enough friction, obviously, the board took the extraordinary step of firing Sam Altman. I think that all that really ends up coming of it is people realizing kind of how nonsensical this structure was in the first place, the nonprofit board being removed and eliminated, and Sam either back at the company in full or overseeing it for Microsoft or whatever it is. But to me, okay, this is in some ways a very fun because it's such a hot topic and so unique, but one-off situation. But what about B Corps? So where you do have these governance structures that are supposed to be having these dual missions of furthering some sort of specific public good that the company says they're committed to and representing the interests of investors and shareholders, employees, and everything else. And I just started to wonder whether we're not, at similar risk for some of these problems happening there too. Because if you have what are effectively independent board members with their own ideological views and agenda, and if they think that their job is to further that, and clearly the OpenAI board members believe that, or I think they were wrong, but they certainly believed it, why wouldn't these problems reoccur in B Corps as well?
Wasn't the money, I mean, you could talk about the structure till, we're blue in the face, but didn't the money basically compromise this mission from the beginning? Like, if you get 13 billion in funding from one investor, Microsoft, even if a lot of that is in Azure credits, right? Like, how could you possibly, they're one of the biggest publicly traded companies in the world. How
Yeah.
could you possibly do that and look yourself in the face in the mirror and say, you know what, we're still going to be, sticking with this mission of, advancing artificial general intelligence in a safe way? Like, doesn't that go out the window the
Yeah.
minute that check is cut?
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't mean that every company has to then operate in a way that maximizes profits at the expense of safety. You can make a choice to say we need AI to advance and be regulated in a responsible way for the industry to succeed long term for the good of our investors. So that's a reasonable position to take. But yeah, I mean, what they should have done is said this is a potentially is massive business, and we're going to establish the OpenAI Foundation, and that's our nonprofit arm, and that'll have its own board, and they will get a certain amount of revenue or proceeds, whatever it is, every year, and they can spend it on responsible AI governance and things like that. That would have been a much more logical approach. Having a nonprofit board running a for-profit company ended up being as silly as it sounds.
Is the AI field actually all it's cracked up to be if companies that are working on this need to raise that magnitude of money? I mean, there was a Washington Post report that talked a little bit about how another thing that Sam was working on was potentially raising some money from some sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East, and they were concerned that it would be used, this money would end up, helping build AI that would be used for surveillance and population control. What do you think
Yeah,
about that?
I mean, first of all, that's certainly possible. I assume that like most technologies, it's very expensive at the beginning, especially when it's transformational technology. And as the large language models get built and perfected and everything else, the cost ultimately goes down. But even now, I really, in the way that we look at investing, we separate out generative AI from AI broadly, right? So we're not generative AI investors. We don't have any
Hmm.
particular expertise in that space. But most of my portfolio companies are using AI in some form to do their job. Now, I don't consider them AI companies. I consider them digital health companies or legal tech companies or whatever they might be. Um, but AI has become a fairly commonplace tool for most tech companies now to use in some fashion. So that's really the broad-based application of it. ChatGPT or whatever else it is sort of a cool, quirky thing, and maybe will end up being really meaningful. Maybe it won't. But the vast majority is it's a tool. It's higher computer processing, just like quantum computing will be, just like blockchain is a tool that makes sense for some companies to use, and everything else.
Exactly. So, what have your VC friends been saying in your group chats about this?
Yeah.
Is this going to lead to a change in the way that they do business outside of the oh my God, what happened stuff?
Right. No, I mean, I think again, because it was so weird and unique, and you've got like every buzzword, right? Sam Altman's really famous, Microsoft, artificial intelligence, Chat GPT. Like, if you were writing this, like you said, as like a screenplay, you
Hmm.
could have thrown in more sort of things that would generate excitement and attention. So, look, I think everyone finds the structure they had to be ridiculous. Everyone assumes that Sam will end up back in charge one way or another. I think the tender offer will still move forward. Is it possible that the people who are buying it at 80 decide now it's only worth 60? Sure, as you and I know, this stuff is all very variable. But at the same time, the underlying business hasn't changed one way or the other once Sam's back in control. And so I think that everyone is looking at this from two ways. One is the hey, this is a fun shit show, and it's
It
fun for
sure
everyone to
is.
talk about and gossip
Yeah.
about and everything else. And then the other would be let's make sure that none of us are ever in this position. And again, I don't think we're ever going to be in the sense of any of us investing in a company that's then run by a nonprofit board. That's why I brought up the B Corp thing, because I think that starts to get a little more close to reality where there are, Warby Parker or Allbirds, Kickstarter. I mean, there are some really legitimate companies that are B
Hmm.
Corps. That's not bad, but I do think that it is worth asking the question of, what is the responsibility of those board members to the investors? Because if those board members say we have no responsibility to the investors, which is obviously how the OpenAI board members saw it, that's a problem.
Definitely. So, is your prediction that Sam ends up back at OpenAI?
Yes, I think last time I checked, there were over 700 of the 700
Right.
employees said they were leaving. So, yeah. Now, again, whether it's some structure where it runs up through him, through Microsoft in some way, or he's the CEO, I think he was back in charge one way or the other, regardless.
Exactly. It's so odd that Microsoft is apparently in the situation where Satya Nadella has basically had last second notice of this firing, then tries to orchestrate a return, can't in the time frame that he needs to before the market opens, goes out and tells everybody that Altman and Greg Brockman are joining Microsoft, and now has come and said, well, maybe they'll go back to OpenAI, and indeed that might be what happened. A
Yeah,
lot of
look,
people,
he needed to staunch the bleeding. He did.
yeah,
He's a really good CEO. But ultimately, they've got $13 billion in this company, and they need to see it succeed.
right. It seems like they were also just a bit too risky, don't you think? I mean, I guess they needed this AI part of the house, but it was like one hell of a bargain, don't you think, that to put themselves in that situation?
Well, you kind of have to wonder what
Mm-hmm.
the lawyers said in the
Mm-hmm.
room internally at Microsoft around putting that kind of money, 11 figures, right,
Mm-hmm.
into that kind of structure. I assume lots of counsel said this is a terrible idea. We can't do it this way. And Microsoft said it is existential for our long-term future to be inextricably linked to AI. This is the best opportunity for us to do that. and we will agree to some sort of unusual structures as a result. Clearly, there's a regret now, but I don't think they would regret making the investment. The regret would only be if Sam never came back and 700 employees left and the company fell apart. Assuming that's averted, and I suspect it will be, it probably works out for them. But again, it is hard to envision anybody agreeing to ever invest in a structure like that.
Right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the broader story in the US right now, which is this upcoming 2024 election. We're less than a year away
We're in the
from
cycle.
election day.
Politics, yeah.
Sorry?
As we say in politics, we're in the cycle.
We're in the cycle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it feels crazy to me that we're going to go into this with Biden and Trump as the nominees. You have
Yeah.
Trump, who obviously is damaged in his own way. He seems to have gotten more radical since he left office. He
Yeah.
tried to overthrow the U.S. government, like very clearly.
Yes.
And then you have Biden, who like is just falling behind him in all these polls, and people say he's too old, and there's definitely deep discomfort with the more vocal left, shall we say, among
Yeah.
mainstream voters in the country. What's your view of what's happening in the U.S. right now, and where do you think this heads?
Yeah, two things. So one is from a specific election standpoint, I think the polls are reflective of what people are telling the pollsters, but we're also still pretty far out from the election itself. There are a bunch of variables that, until we see how they play out, make it very hard to make any sort of even vaguely accurate prediction around where it's going to end up. So the first one being what happens in Trump's trials. Is he convicted of a felony? If so, when? Is it before the general election? Is there a tipping point? Like with his base, it seems clear that every indictment actually only makes him stronger. But
Mm-hmm.
with independents, is there a tipping point where if you get convicted of a felony, then they say, "Okay, I'm out"? I don't know, and my guess is no, there's not. But that's number one. Number two, look, Biden's certainly not going to get any younger. He turned 81 yesterday.
Oh, yesterday, yeah.
But how's he doing? Right? There's a world where they put him in bubble wrap, keep him inside the White House, and say the best thing we can do is for people to see him as little as possible. And there's a world where they say we need to prove that he's a lot more vigorous and vibrant than people think, and they put him out there. Whichever approach or strategy they use comes with its own set of risks. So how do those materialize, right? Three, the economy and the perception of the economy. It's interesting that we're at a moment right now where at least politically, the perception of the economy is more important than the reality of the economy, right? So, where does inflation go? Does it soften? And does anyone feel it enough that it changes their view? What happens to interest rates? Clearly, it would juice the economy, and on every VC, watching this right now, it's like cut interest rates, because we certainly need that. But I get the sense that Powell doesn't really care what any president thinks, and that's to his credit, broadly speaking. So where's that? For the war in Israel, maybe there's a ceasefire as soon as today, based on the reports. Maybe it becomes a more regional conflict. Maybe it becomes a global conflict, right? We have no idea. Fifth, Hunter Biden, is what happens with him? Is there some sort of prosecution, conviction? Where do those Republican impeachment hearings lead? So there are so many different things that we don't even know the answers to yet, that we can analyze the race to say, here's where we think it would go, depending on how any of those 5 or 6 variables play out. But you can't make an analysis without that. But let me make a broader point, which is just, we live in a world with incredible cognitive dissonance, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a statistical standpoint, the world from a macro level is in the best shape it's ever been, right? In terms of life expectancy and infant mortality and literacy and extreme poverty and all of that. And it feels worse than ever. And it feels worse than ever for a few reasons. One is because of social media, we're constantly seeing what we don't have and what other people seem to have who are doing better than us. That makes us anxious. Two, everything that ever goes wrong is now news to the entire world immediately. So if Cruise has an autonomous vehicle in San Francisco that crosses the long yellow line, we all know about it, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, autonomous taxis are terrible. No, they're not. It's, they're going to take time to develop. And there's so much uncertainty. I think Gen Z especially just feels between climate change and the impacts of COVID and the psychological impacts of social media, especially fragile and upset. And so as a result, people want change, right? And they always think that it was better before. So it seems to me like, for example, one thing the Biden team is really getting wrong, in my view, is they keep trying to impeach Trump on the same moral arguments. And it's like, we all get it. He's a scumbag. Like, there's no one that doesn't understand that. Their problem is a lot of people are saying, yes, he is what he is, but they feel like they were better off when he was president than they feel today, and they're willing to make that trade-off. And Biden's got to convince people that actually, no, you weren't better off, and you'll be even worse off if he's put back in office than you are right now. You've got to impeach him substantively, because people are always these days going to be upset with the status quo, and they're always going to assume that it had to have been better before than it is now.
Okay, I want to seize on one thing that you said at the very beginning of that answer, which is that Trump may be, I mean, he has like what, 3 or 4 cases that are pending against him.
Yeah.
He might be convicted of a felony. What do you think the chances of that happening are? And if he is, can he like still run and then win the presidency?
Yes, yes. So legally he can. Eugene Debs, who was a socialist candidate, I think it was maybe 1924, 28, actually ran his presidential campaign from a prison cell. So
What did he do?
I think he was just a socialist and threw him in jail for it. Probably incited violence at some protest or something
Right.
like that.
Okay.
So yes, he can, and it is unclear if you take, for example, the Georgia election prosecution. If he is the sitting president, it is unclear at best whether he can be prosecuted while he's president, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the federal crime, so there's 4 crimes. So there's kind of espionage and treason, right? So that's sort of a documents case in January 6th. He can pardon himself on both of those, so those go away. Then there's the New York Stormy Daniels crime, which is pretty de minimis. I'm not even sure he gets convicted on that one. And then the Georgia election one, which is serious. I think they've got a good shot at conviction.
In that state.
That's actually county. It's like
Okay.
Fulton County, Georgia. So so then the question is, can they imprison the sitting president for something like that? I think the answer is, legal scholars seem to be saying no. So I think if Trump wins, he's probably in the clear from a legal standpoint, at least for these actions, for the term. Maybe he then has to serve prison time after that. Maybe he's dead by then. Who knows? But yeah, his best shot at freedom is winning the election.
Exactly. So we'll see. He's going to be motivated to win. Okay,
Yeah.
talk a little bit about obvious and in hindsight. I mean, it's about this campaign to bring flying cars to market.
Yeah.
And you gave the cruise analogy, so maybe we can talk a little bit about
Sure.
that, because we've had Kyle vote on the show, and I've been bullish about cruise, and now I'm definitely starting to lick my wounds on that one. But I'm curious, like what motivated you to write the book, and what's the
Yeah.
main lesson here? And before you go, I just want to say we have a nice crowd watching on YouTube, so if you have questions for Bradley, we
I was
will
told
take them.
this
Oh
is
yeah,
the
hold up the book. Yeah,
Yeah.
smile, thumbnail, and now go ahead.
All right.
But
So
yeah, if you have questions, we'll take them. So,
Yes.
but go ahead.
the novel's about a campaign to legalize flying cars in New York, LA, and Austin. On one side is the flying car startup and their vicious political consultants, and on the other side is Uber, the Audubon Society, the socialists, the transit unions, and the Russian mob. And it is deliberately somewhat absurdist, but what I'm trying to show in the book is, while the decisions that the VCs make, the founders make, the politicians make in the book are maybe a little crazy, the underlying motivations that shape their decisions are exactly what happens in real life, and exactly the ways that we think about all of these things. And I just think that if you can understand why people make the decisions they make, then you have a chance of doing something about it. And if you just sit there and sort of just deny reality or just wish they were better people, you can't affect anything. It came about, so I wrote a memoir a couple of years ago called The Fixer, about kind of the I've been doing in politics and tech. And who Steven Soderbergh is? He's a movie director, Traffic, American Brockovich, and all that stuff, Ocean's 11. So he read it. He said, hey, we should make this a TV show. And I started thinking about cool, Steven Soderbergh wants to make a TV show, would be
Yeah.
awesome, right?
Right.
Um, what would be a little more future focused, because like all my day job all day is to legalize sort of new disruptive technologies, right? And so
Hmm.
flying cars felt out there enough, and I wrote a campaign plan for how I would legalize them, just like we would in real life.
Yeah.
Stephen and I worked on the pilot together. I wrote 9 more episodes, and then our big meeting to pitch it was with Apple TV for March 10th, 2020. As you can imagine, that
Yeah.
didn't happen. And I decided during the pandemic, like maybe I can turn this into a novel. And I had no idea how to write a novel, but eventually figured it out. And got lucky enough that somebody wanted to publish it. And the cool thing is, Stephen and I are now back at it again. So I was in LA last week on meetings to see if we can make this a TV show.
That'd be great. I'd love to watch the show. And it does have so many parallels, right? Because it seems like there's so many cutting edge technologies that are coming out of Silicon Valley, and like the big question is like, how does this get in the hands of people safely, right? That's the through line with OpenAI.
Yep.
Um,
That's why, in fact, that's when we were sort of making a case like you could have 10 seasons, right?
yeah,
Because you can just pick a
exactly.
new disruptive technology. And what's also amazing is flying cars have made, or eVTOLs, it
Hmm.
really so much progress since when I first started working on this. So it went from this like kind of still fantastical concept to like the mayor of New York City had an event with Joby last week, like, and it was like literally bringing together the real life of city politics and flying cars in the way that when I wrote it in the book was meant to be totally, futuristic and fantastic.
Do you think that we have a healthy relationship with the way that we like either, yeah, with the way that we let technology go to market? I mean, it's so interesting. Let me set this up. So you have Facebook, right, which everyone's like, we move too fast, we let them no guardrails at all, and
Yeah.
of course they came out and had some externalities, shall we say? And then we had something like Cruise, which you mentioned, which like seems like it's on a good direction. It made a mistake, right? It definitely dragged this pedestrian about 20 feet,
Yeah.
which like it's terrible.
Yeah.
But like overall, the safety record looked good, and now who knows what's going to happen to that company? So where do you think like society is in terms of allowing people to
Yeah.
bring
I mean,
technology to market?
couple things. So first of all, by definition, regulation has to lag innovation, because
Hmm.
until the founder comes up with the new idea and executes on it, there's nothing to regulate. And if the
Right.
bureaucrat who does the regulation could have thought of the new idea, he or she would be the founder, not the bureaucrat, right? It typically, in my experience, every new startup falls into one of two buckets. The
Hmm.
first is they come up with a better way to do something, right? So the first tech thing I ever worked on was Uber. And Travis didn't invent the idea of paying someone to take you from point A to point B, but he came up with a much better way to do it. And
Hmm.
ultimately, all the political and regulatory fights we had were really market share fights through the guise of regulation. And that's true for Airbnb and FanDuel and kind of everything in existing markets. And then there's the white spaces, right? So that could be AI or crypto or autonomous vehicles or flying cars or whatever you want, where the good news is there's no entrenched interest that you're having to take down and disrupt and fight with. But the bad news is there's no regulatory framework at all, right? And so you got to figure the whole thing out. And so in a case like Cruise, there is no AV regulatory framework yet. There's patchwork stuff by different cities and different states. The federal government has refused to deal with it. And I think, yes, we obviously what happened there was terrible, and we have to be careful of it. But as I understand it, an American is killed in a car accident every 15 minutes of the day, 24 hours a
Hmm.
day, 365 days a year. If we don't want that to keep happening, we have to have autonomous vehicles. They will ultimately be much safer. And in order to have them, they've got to be deployed, they've got to be tested, and they're going to make some mistakes. And that's not to say that you then don't try to make them as safe as possible and regulate it. But if they have sort of a zero tolerance policy that one thing happens and then they're sort of deterred for years, all that's going to do is means that tens and tens of thousands of innocent people are going to keep dying in car accidents when they don't have to.
Right, exactly. And so we had a question here. Should we acquire Cruise from Marshmallow? Thank you for the question, Marshmallow. Look, I think he's saying Cruise, or they are saying Cruise, the car company, not Ted Cruz, even though we got the spelling.
I definitely
But
would not want to acquire Ted Cruz.
okay,
Car company, I still think, look, this is always the tension, right? Which is it possible that the politics and narrative and everything else around this really does sink crews? Maybe. But does the underlying technology persevere? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. We got 3 minutes left. I got to ask you about Eric Adams, the
Yeah.
mayor of New York City.
Yep.
You know, I guess I liked Adams because he was like a New Yorker after our two Boston based mayors, right? Bloomberg and de Blasio. If I see another New York mayor wear a Red Sox hat to a baseball game, I got to move somewhere else.
So
But
as I get to, as someone who ran Bloomberg's campaign,
yeah,
he is not a Red Sox fan or a Yankees fan or a Mets fan or really any sort of sports fan. So
look, I mean,
there's
I
no
worked,
loyalties there at all, basically.
okay, well, we'll put that on de Blasio. But Adams just, it seemed in when he took office, he was going to be very entertaining and a walking scandal. And
Yep.
he seems like he's been both. What's
Yep.
your sort of
That's totally true.
1 minute assessment of what's
So
going
look,
on with him?
on one hand, what's happening is remarkable. So for the viewers that aren't familiar, about a week ago, the FBI approached him on the street and seized his phones, right? Which is a remarkable
Right.
act because there's 20 other ways they could have done that quietly, right? And instead, they chose to do something incredibly high profile. They've had raids of various homes of staffers of his. They are acting as if they clearly have the goods on the guy, and maybe they do, but then what we know about in terms of what they say he did doesn't sound so bad. So what he's accused of doing is getting money either from the Turkish government or their allies for his campaign, and then calling the fire commissioner and asking him to expedite a certificate of occupancy so the
Mhm.
Turkish embassy could open in time for Erdogan to come to the ceremony. You know, maybe inappropriate, but pretty business as usual, right? And if you're going to take down the mayor of New York City, I think you got to have a better justification than that he called the fire commissioner about something, because one of two things will happen if he gets indicted. Either he refuses to resign, and the lesson from Trump and Menendez and everyone else is just stay in the job. Now we have a mayor governing under indictment. That's bad. Or if he did resign, because we would have the public advocate would replace him, then a special election 90 days later, and then the real election will be about a year and a half later. We could have 4 mayors in 2 years. That's a disaster too. So if Adams was taking bribes in any way, if he did something genuinely, truly immoral and illegal, he should certainly be indicted for it. But if all we're talking about is calling the fire commissioner about a certificate of occupancy, like to me, it's way over.
Absolutely. The book is obvious in hindsight. The author's Bradley Tusk. I can't wait to watch the series, maybe on Apple or
Yeah,
somewhere else.
I might have to find a cameo for you.
Absolutely, yeah. You can have
There,
me as the resident podcaster. But
sounds good.
Bradley,
All
great
right, guys.
talking with you as always. Thank you for being here, and good
Thank
luck
you.
with everything.
Thanks so much. Bye.